not sure. Okay, now we're really ready. So we're focusing on the American Baptist Missionary Union. So India was one of the big targets that they really focused on. Now, the people of India were looked at in those days much as the Native Americans were here. You know, they were savages who needed to be saved, from themselves. Now, India is also polytheistic, so, they're used to having hundreds of gods, and so, it was hard to convince them that one God could be, useful all by himself. So they spent many years and weren't really getting anywhere, and actually talked about folding the project, but then they just said, you know what, let's send more people, let's kind of double down, as they say, and really go for it, and if it still doesn't work, then we'll walk away. Well, part of the team that they sent was an engineer. See, not who you would immediately think of for a mission team, but they were building a canal in India and needed an engineer, and this guy ends up working for this project, which employed hundreds of people. And India is very populous and very poor, so offering jobs was a pretty big deal, and the fact that he was associated with that kind of gave them an in, and so the whole team would be there to minister to the workers when they came off their shift. So and I can't imagine building a canal back then without without the machinery that we enjoy today. So sure to be backbreaking work, but they were there in between to teach and share. And it was Christmas Day, 1877. I can hear the angels singing. Over 2,000 Indians presented themselves for baptism on that day. And check this out. This would never happen today. The missionaries thought, we don't want anybody, like asking for baptism or professing faith just to try to get in good with the engineer. So we're going to kind of hold off on this and make sure they're serious. Yeah. When was the last time you ever? Yeah. And so they spent several months really making sure these guys were for real. And so in July, what is that, 7 months? In July of the next year, they had 6 native ministers, not the missionaries, the native ministers, 6 native ministers spent an entire day baptizing 2,222 new believers. I'm getting chills. Can you imagine that day? All day. And so I'm just like, I'm reading about this and thinking, who waits anymore? We don't even ask them if they understand anything. We're just like, oh, come on down. Fill the water right now. It's almost like dunk them before they can get away. But when the church first started, New Testament church, there was a pretty significant waiting period because they wanted to make sure people were serious before they really got them in the system. And somewhere along the line, we kind of lost that. But these guys, they really got it. And that emphasis on indigenous ministers, that's important. That becomes a running theme. And also, I think it's important that door opened because they helped people help themselves. They gave them jobs. And that was what allowed that, amazing revival. So within a few years, they had baptized over 10,000 people in that area. And then over in the Belgian Congo, this was in the same kind of time frame. There was a single day when over 1,000 native people threw their idols in a giant pile and professed their faith in Christ. Again, one of those days, don't you wish you could have been a fly on the wall, right? And those were great things, and also, in some ways, bad things. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. All right, so who has ever heard, Annette, I think you have a sweatshirt, the Women's Union Missionary Society of America for Heathen Lands. Anybody?
For what?
Every week I make fun of their acronyms. I mean, how did they come up with these? So this was 1861. This was women from all kinds of denominations gathering together to start sending women out as missionaries. And again, this wasn't just Baptists. This was everybody. And this happened because, well, of course, All of the mission boards were men, and all of the missionaries were men or a wife with their man. And there were women who said, I feel called to missions. And the men would be like, what? That does not compute. You know, it was really freaking them out. So the Women's Union Missionary Society of America for Heathen Lands only lasted a few years because each denomination started building up their own women's missions apparatus. So that was, but that kind of, it's just a great name. I had to bring it up. So there were women who felt called, but there were also mission fields sending word back and saying, we need women out here. You know, there were many very conservative societies, Asia in particular, where a man was not going to walk into their house and not going to see their wife. You know, it was very, very kind of closeted, if you will. And so they said, we need women to reach the homes. If we want to get into the families, we've got to have some women. And the poor men running the mission stuff, they were like, we just can't wrap our minds around a woman going out there without a man to protect her. And so they really just wouldn't do it. And so women said, well, watch us, and started making their own organizations. They raised their own money. They sent their own missionaries. It's still, you know, I get it because I understand the times they were in, but it's just such a sad thing that it was that. But again, this was the era when men still believed, I'm not exaggerating or making any of this up, they still believed that if a woman tried to engage in higher education, that it would hurt her brain and make her less able to bear children. This is real. So the thought of a woman missionary going out, you know, without a strong arm to lean on, you know, they couldn't get their brains around it. And in fact, the idea of an unprotected white woman going amidst the savages literally made people lose their minds. And so the women's missions groups had to be kind of quiet about what they were doing so that people didn't freak out. But they didn't stop. They just... This was 2001? This was last year. And it was, as so many times war changes things, but the Civil War was a time when there were some shifts in some of this stuff. And by 1870, the Missionary Union started accepting women applicants. And so while waiting for the men to get their act together, the Women's Society sent out 113 women and supported 284 natives. They called them Bible women. That's good. Straight and to the point. No fancy stuff. I'm a Bible woman. Now, in the early days, mission support was really like, okay, John, here's your funding, there's your field, let us know how it goes, you know, and it was very, I guess, empowering. All the decisions were made in the field. If you were the missionary, you decided how best to reach those people and the projects to invest in. It was all on you. And of course, over time, the emphasis on the home office grew. And so by the time, you know, we're coming along, they are directed by the home office. And this is true of pretty much any missionaries now. So American Baptists were also very big on education. I like that. They believed that training people would, one, make them better and better able to care for themselves, and also better able to embrace the gospel. They also wanted to strengthen indigenous churches. They weren't dependent. There's always the risk of creating dependence in missions. And they said, you know, people in any given country are best converted by their own. People who speak their language, have their culture. So that's what we're going to invest in. And of course, there were some who are just like, but we can't put too much money into schools and stuff. We need to save the lost. Sounds like Baptist, doesn't it? This classic Baptist argument. Should we empower people, or should we try to get them down that aisle? Should we be doing big revivals, or spending all of this time teaching them things? You see what I'm... Classic. And it just so happened that while this back and forth was going, This mass conversion happens in the Congo. Stories get back. Mass conversion in India. Stories get back. And if you recall, I read out some numbers a week or two ago about the missionaries and the people on the ground, and barely a quarter of the missionaries were ordained ministers. The vast majority of them were educators. That was really their main thing. But those big conversions kind of turned the tide in the favor of evangelism only. And during the last half of the 1800s, the mission group phased itself out of education and really just kind of focused on evangelism. But they made it clear, the Missions Union always said, we don't want to create Northern Baptist or American Baptist churches overseas. We want to help start indigenous churches that are self-supporting and self-directing. And so by the end of the 1800s, 524 of their 853 mission churches were self-supporting, and 2/3 of their mission schools were self-supporting. Now, there was a day when foreign missions was the only kind of missions. There was just no other such thing. But when the Wild West started opening up, a new mission field arose, and they're like, well, it's not exactly foreign, although it feels foreign to the people from the East. And American Baptists, they wrote, in some of the things they wrote to each other, they noted that as soon as there are 6 houses together, a saloon pops up. And these poor heathens need churches, And so this is a great quote. They said, while sin is moving west by steam, it will never do for Christianity to go afoot. So they just said, the West is a mission field. And they also said, the South is a mission field. Can't really argue with them, but by 1900, the American Baptist Home Mission Society had commissioned over 24,000 missionaries and teachers. So they really focused on church buildings. They had estimated at one point there were 2,500 Baptist churches with nowhere to meet. That's hard to imagine in the day of Baptist church on every corner, isn't it? So there were 7 entire states out west that collectively had 9 Baptist-owned buildings. You know how big those states are. 7 states with 9 Baptist buildings among them, like buildings that church buildings. That's and these are big swaths of land. So they really focused on buildings and kind of repairing after the Civil War. They worked to repair these devastated buildings. Some were abandoned. They tried to fix those back up. Spent a lot of energy and time and money supporting the thousands of new black churches now that they were free and didn't have to go sit in the balcony of First Baptist. They started their own churches. The Northern Baptists started the Freedmen's Institute, which provided basic education for ministers and deacons. Started a number of colleges for the free blacks throughout the South. Now, most of those, it's funny for me to think of colleges coming and going, but the ones that we see are the ones that made it. But there were a lot that were started. Morehouse College in Atlanta is a very prominent example of one that survived, but for every one that survived, there may have been 15 that came and went. That's how hard that era was on higher education. I'll talk more about that later. Now, the Southerners did not like it that the Northerners thought they were a mission field, because that would be like, the church in Richmond just being like, can we come, take care of Urbanna? And we'd be like, what are you trying to say, right? I mean, so it was like coming in and saying, you're not doing your job, so we're going to come do it for you. That's the message that the South heard. They felt like the Northern missionaries were invading their territory and were like, you could just send us the money and we'll do all the work. It didn't come out very well. And then, oh man, immigration. Anybody feel like immigration's a big issue? Oh wait, we're talking about the 1800s. In the early 1800s, immigration averaged about 8,000 a year. So about 8,000 new people from foreign lands joined the United States. And by the time we got to about 1820, it had gone up to around 15,000 a year. That's a lot of immigrants, isn't it? I mean, 15,000 a year. And then between 1880 and 1900, who wants to guess how many immigrants per year came to America? 1 million a year. That's an increase, almost tenfold there. So in the space of 20 years, roughly 20 million new citizens to America. And everyone was so worried that all of these new people would just be the ruin of everything America held dear. Gosh, I don't know why I keep flipping into the present tense. Immigrants were compared to the barbarian hordes that overran the Roman Empire. And so I'm typing this up, just freaking out over immigration is not a new thing. And we survived. I want to point that out. Have 20 million immigrants come into America recently? Something tells me the numbers are a little lower now. But it's the same kind of stuff. Every time there was an influx, people would be like, "Oh, they're going to ruin us," and somehow it all came out okay.
Where did they come from?
Everywhere. But yeah, see, here's the thing: the initial immigration was mostly from Western Europe, the people who were kind of white. Yeah, and we didn't like the Irish people, but they were white at least. And then people from farther west, with darker skin, started thinking they could come, and this really upset people. Wait, see, I keep forgetting that I'm talking about the 1800s. So it was partly because they weren't all white immigrants, but that's just kind of how it goes. The more different they appear, the more people freaked out. So anyway, the American Baptists were like, hey, some of the American Baptists said, this is a mission field, and they're coming to us. We don't even have to travel to find them. This is great. And some others were like, they're a bunch of heathen, gospel-hating, beer-guzzling Sabbath breakers. There must have been some Germans in the bunch. I'm just guessing. And so there was this back and forth. Should we panic like everybody else, or should we say, praise God, they're coming right to our doorstep? At one point, the Home Mission Society had, in the United States, ministries with 21 different nationality groups. And just as usual, building up their indigenous ministers so that they could have their own thing. So the German Baptist Church started in New York City, a Swedish and Norwegian churches in Illinois, the first Danish Baptist church in Wisconsin, of all places, Wisconsin, and Chinese church in Sacramento. So these were very successful ministries in a lot of ways. But over time, the Northern Mission Board really started focusing on the West. That kind of became their preoccupation, and they neglected the South and most of the original colonies to focus on that. Now, education. We got to talk about education a little bit, and probably will next week as well. So there was, at one time, the American Baptist Education Society. There had been, religious people, and Baptists in particular, have always liked starting their own schools, particularly to raise up ministers and that kind of stuff. But it was a very scattered kind of approach. And like the Mid-Tidewater Association would try to start something and not even tell the people over there, and they'd all kind of be at odds and sometimes not helping and competing with each other. And this American Baptist Education Society initially was both American Baptist and Southern Baptist. They worked together for a while. This was an organization that started after the war, so they could there was no bad history in this particular organization. So they'd meet 1 year in a northern state and 1 year in a southern state, and everybody worked together for a few years. Just a few. This was the group that helped start Furman, Carson Newman, and the great Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which I'll talk about more in the future. And Then, the Southerners were getting a little less excited. We've never really been huge on education in the South. And then sort of the breaking point came when the big project was the University of Chicago. Did anybody know that the University of Chicago was started by Baptists? I mean, it is one of our foremost research universities in America. So in 1890, the Rockefellers donated the money, and Marshall Field, like the Field Museum in Chicago, a big tycoon up there, donated the land. And it did, honestly, it is one of the crown jewels of American education. But this became such a big project that sucked up so much focus and money that it soured a lot of people on the whole starting colleges thing. And it didn't help that world-class education and doctrinal purity don't live together well. Do you hear what I'm saying? If you just want everybody to toe the line, higher education is not the place to go because you're taught to think about things and consider alternatives, and it just doesn't go together well. So that caused all sorts of problems, and shortly thereafter, the Education Society folded.
You say this is after the war?
That was post-war.
When are there?
What, did I get my
The service schools that were begun before the war.
service schools?
Huh?
I'm not sure what you're...
Service schools.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, University of Richmond is one.
Yep.
Forest is one.
Yes, I will touch on all of those.
Okay.
I will. Yeah, that's an interesting story. But yeah, I'll circle back around to education. I might not get to it tonight, but I will. Yeah, I have a thing in there about University of Richmond. It will be acknowledged, so don't worry. So, enough about the North. Just to be fair and balanced, I talked about them. But now we're talking about the stuff that's important in the South. The first thing, as soon as there was a Southern Baptist convention, they started their own foreign mission board, which is now the IMB, and it has always been in Richmond. You guys probably knew that. The first 6 people they asked to lead this new organization all declined. And finally, they found a Richmond pastor named James Taylor. This was before he became a famous singer. He accepted the office, and his deal was he would be in charge of their $11,735 annual budget and spend at least 2 days a week on the enterprise. Isn't this great? Think about how big the International Mission Board is now. Now, originally, this is interesting, despite that very humble beginning, the Foreign Mission Board was better known and really more influential than the convention itself. Because, missions was what got people excited. And they actually received very little funding from the convention. They had their own team of traveling fundraisers who went around church to church and told stories and whipped up support and encouraged giving through individual churches and the associations. So they kind of bypassed the whole convention, which is kind of funny. Who knows the very first country that Southern Baptists decided to target for their missions? It's not a country. It's a continent. Yes. No pressure in that, but really.
Tell us.
China. China. And, of course, you know the name of the first Southern Baptist missionary, Samuel Clopton. You're like, of course we know this. No, we do not know this. You don't remember him because he died a few months after leaving. But China was a very fertile mission ground. By 1881, they had enough churches in Shanghai to have the Shanghai Baptist Association. Yes, big score. Now, the person you've been waiting to talk about, Edmonia Moon. Everybody knows Edmonia. She was the first woman to go and work in China. And about a year later, her sister Charlotte joined her. See, I kind of pulled a little fast one on you there. You didn't know about that. You also know about Orion Moon, right? Orion. Yeah, she was a Church of Christ missionary. I had never heard of her until I worked on this. Still a whole lot of single women out there, so Eddie and Lottie really stood out. Edmonia helped start the Baptist Ladies Missionary Association in Richmond before going to China. Now, the Moon family was very well off and also very progressive in an era where most girls at most did finishing school, which is where you learn the skills necessary to be a good wife. They insisted that their girls get the same schooling as the boys. And Orianne Moon was the very first woman physician in Virginia. See, you didn't know that. You did know that. Yeah, that's good. Extra point for you. And she was a surgeon in the Confederate hospitals during the Civil War. Score one for the ladies. Lottie was apparently only about 4 feet tall and would not allow herself to be, to have her picture taken standing by anybody. Oh, thanks. Man, that's cool. But she was a giant in other ways. Y'all know this. A gift for languages, great speaker, and for much of her career, she was the only missionary in her whole region. There just wasn't this big, machine of missionaries. It was just her. And when she was on furlough, she would come back and dress in authentic Chinese garb and bring interesting artifacts and give these dynamite speeches. So she, probably more than anybody, stirred up interest in foreign missions. Now, of course, some of the men complained because it was an awful lot like a woman preaching. And Lottie said, "Send some men who can do better," and they shut up. Now, of course, at the missions meetings, usually the women would go off to the side and they would knit quietly and talk about their kids while the men worked on important stuff. And Lottie's like, "I'm going to be in the meeting, thank you very much." And of course, they just weren't too sure about that. She was very vocal about equal rights and the right of women to be involved. And in 1884, the Foreign Mission Board leadership, all men, they decided that Lottie was just going too far in this whole women stuff. Here is her reply. "It seems to be the purpose of the committee to relegate me henceforth to the first class of women troublemakers. I distinctly decline from being so relegated. Will you be so kind as to request the board to appropriate the proper sum to pay my return passage to Virginia? On arrival, I will send in my resignation." And they decided that she could be just as active as she wanted to be. Backed them down again. In 1887, Lottie was overdue for furlough, but she refused to leave the mission field before a replacement came to continue her work, and they just could not afford to send anybody. So Lottie sent word to the Baptist women of Virginia, suggesting that maybe they could take up a special offering at Christmas time, just this once, to support her work. And in 1888, the newly formed WMU decided to announce a week of prayer and special Christmas offerings for missions, kind of building on that isolated idea. You may know that Lottie refused to eat when the girls at the school where she worked, education, she wouldn't eat when they didn't have enough, and eventually died in 1912. And so in 1913, the Christmas offering, which had become a little bit of a tradition, was advertised as a memorial for Lottie's first Christmas in heaven. And they had record offerings that year. Record offerings always get people's attention. And a few years later, this was 1918, you probably never heard of Annie Armstrong, just a corresponding secretary for the WMU, that's all. She suggested that they name their annual offering after Lottie Moon. Genius! And it is estimated that more than $500 million have been raised for missions thanks to that offering alone. Not bad for a little 4-foot woman who was supposed to keep quiet and knit. So, the Civil War. Oh man, so the Foreign Mission Board, it grew. They had 113 churches in 6 nations. And then the Civil War hit. The blockade was a little problematic because when the North blockaded the South, they couldn't get supplies either direction, requests or supplies. And then after the war, there was no money. The South was broke. almost entirely and literally. And so it was a bad stretch there for the missionaries. They had to scramble and often take normal jobs and do whatever it took to stay on the field. And somewhere in there, they started the Board of Domestic Missions, which is now the Home Mission Board. It was established in Alabama. Didn't move to Atlanta till several years later. And so here they had this, the South was obviously a big mission field, a lot of underserved people there. And virtually all of the Baptist ministers in the South were bivocational. The whole idea of career minister had not really made it that far yet. And then they had, the Southwest and the West, and there was virtually no gospel there at all, as I mentioned earlier. And so they saw the need, but the whole idea of home missions took quite a while to catch on, because people thought, well, if it's home missions, then that's what churches do, right? Because the churches it's their home, and so churches didn't really want to send their money so that somebody could do something that they were supposed to do. It just took a while for them to catch the vision, and because they had almost no money, they couldn't do much, couldn't send out many missionaries or anything, so they got a reputation for not doing anything and being ineffective. And many missionaries and leaders went back to the northern system, to the American Baptists who had money. And on top of that, and I'll talk about this some more later too, there was kind of an anti-mission sentiment beginning to grow. It always happens. All of history is like the grandfather clock. It goes this way, it's going to go back the other way. That's just what happens. And so for a while, missions was the thing, and then it started like, why are we putting all this money into, remember where all this started? When they said, hey, God will just save those heathens when he's ready to. And so we had the swing to all-out missions, and it was starting to come back the other way. The Civil War was a great opportunity in terms of reaching soldiers, people who were able to chaplain and kind of be there during that time. Fantastic opportunity to reach people. But if you just think about, the destruction, so schools and colleges, an awful lot of schools and colleges never survived the Civil War. Newspapers, other Baptist projects, just were wiped out. And even those that survived, limped out with no funding and a devastated economy. And so when the Northerners, the American Baptists, devoted, a great amount of their missions investment to the South, the Home Mission Board complained a little bit, but they couldn't do it themselves, so they just accepted that. There was talk about dissolving the Home Mission Board, which is interesting to me. But in 1882, the leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention decided to be a little radical, so they fired the entire mission board, moved the headquarters to Atlanta, and just started over completely. And because of the tight funding, the local associations were more interested than they had been in working with the home office, so to speak, and listening to a national organization. So that was kind of what laid the groundwork for what we're familiar with in terms of the national and associational levels of control, I guess. Now, this is interesting. I had never thought about this, but the Southern Baptists left the American Baptist Convention, but most churches still got their Sunday school materials from the same place they'd always gotten. We're creatures of habit, aren't we? And it was an American Baptist publishing house in Philadelphia. And it wasn't until 1891 that the Southern Baptists finally were able to establish the Sunday school board, now Lifeway, so that they could have their own stuff. And, it's like, why should we let those Northerners tell our kids what... Now, it sounds like a really big deal to not have your own publishing house, but that was when Sunday school was really this kind of weird and edgy new ministry. Only about half of churches offered a Sunday school. Yes, there was a time. Yes. You know why there's a Second Baptist Church in Richmond, don't you?
No.
Because First Baptist was not interested in having a Sunday school, and the members who believed in this new ministry left and started another church. All true. So, there you go. Yeah, so next time we will talk more about Baptist colleges and kind of the educational aspect, because that's an important part of our heritage and history. And also, how many of you know about the landmark movement? Okay, good. So you will not want to miss when we talk about landmarkism, because we run into it routinely, but you just didn't know that's what it was. So just you wait. Good, good. Any questions, comments, deep thoughts? See, now you know all three of the Moon sisters. It's just so not fair that only Lottie gets remembered. But I do want to point out, those girls had parents who said they're going to school and they're getting education even though they're not supposed to. Without that, who knows? All right, that's it. No questions?
Thank you.
All right, let's close with a word of prayer. Father, we're grateful for the example of Lottie and Orianne and Edmonia and so many other people who were not willing to be told that they couldn't pursue their calling. They heard you speak and they said, we're doing this, even if it goes against our culture. And Lord, we're amazed at the way you worked through those missionaries and the way that your gospel just broke through the false religions that so many people were swallowed up by. And Lord, we praise you for the way that the gospel has spread. We know it still needs to spread more, and we know that sometimes our bickering as Baptists has kept us from doing all that we should have to spread the gospel. And we thank you for this better knowledge of our own history and about things that have shaped us and our church, even if we didn't notice their influence. We thank you for the example of so many people who followed their hearts and followed your will. It's in the name of Christ that we lift these prayers. Amen.
Amen.